Sergio started this workshop. I'm ending it. I'll start with a pretty trivial statement that we all are different. So we have different conditions, physical conditions. We have different backgrounds. Some of us like rent control, some of us hate it. And of course, we also live in different types of housing. Some of us live in these nice houses to the left of me. Others are living in the crowded apartments like that on the right. So there's an inequality also concerning housing. And it has many different manifestations, including the size of housing, including housing tenure. So some people are tenants, some are landlords or subtenants. And what I'm going to focus here on now is the inequality in terms of housing cost, or I will call it housing affordability. Anyway, the housing, especially this inequality in housing affordability, can have important impacts, or for example, on the health. So for instance, if you spend too much on housing, less money is left for food, for leisure, for other activities, and therefore it can have repercussions on your health. It can also have impact on the social mobility, because if you have to squeeze yourself with your household in a small crowded dwelling, then in many cases people have to share the same room with other persons, and these can have impact on school performance of children and therefore on their future lives. So that's an important issue, as I think. So let's first look at the long-term evolution of housing affordability. I hope you can see it. I mean, I'm sorry, I wanted to make it more visible, but I succeeded to make it less visible because most of the lines are gray, light gray. So what does this show? Here we have different countries with a measure of housing cost divided by overall cost, by overall consumer spending. So typically we are faced with some rent burden or housing burden measured as housing cost proportion in the disposable income of the households. Here it's not this measure, although total income correlates with total consumption expenditure, but not perfectly, because the difference is saving, and we know that the savings rate is higher for richer households. But anyway, most of the national statistical offices report this measure. So when they make their household budget surveys, they typically report the different types of expenditure, including housing expenditure. I should say here also that housing expenditure includes not only rents or imputed rents, but also water, electricity, and fuel fees. And finally, what can we see on this picture? So we see that the housing cost share increased between 1940 and 2025, more or less, in many countries. The green line, I don't know if you can see it. Anyway, I will show it. It's Germany. For instance, in Germany, this one. In Germany, this share increased from 15% around 1950 to 32% now, so more than doubled. Now, why did it happen? Or why? Yeah, it's based on, so typically in this household budget survey, you have COICOP groups, 12 groups, with the fourth group being responsible for housing costs. But of course, it's different depending on country. It can be different because, and also because in the course of the time, different definitions were introduced. So it's not perfect as a measure. But anyway, I think it gives some interesting insight that over the time we have almost general increase in the housing cost share. I mean, we're all talking about the housing problems nowadays that are universal, that happen all over the world. Here you can see that it happened also over the time. Now the question is why it happened. Well, one answer is, of course, the housing inflation, meaning that the housing prices increase faster than all other prices, or average prices at least. Another thing is, of course, the improvement in the housing quality, because if you have better housing, you pay more for it. And indeed, if you look, I won't show you the figures, but I have collected data on, for example, square meters per capita over a long period of time, and also on the number of rooms per dwelling or per person. And all of them show that on average, you have an increase in the housing quality, which is also dramatic. In Germany, for example, I'm going to use I use Germany as example because I'm working in Germany and living there. The square meters per capita were 20. There were 20 square meters per capita in around 1960. Now we have 47. So more than doubled the amount of the housing consumption, more than doubled. Now, what is, can you see this picture? Yeah, oh, finally. So now that was the dynamics. What can we say about the inequality of housing cost distribution? So here what you can see is on the horizontal axis is the housing cost share for the 20% of the most poor people. On the vertical axis, you have housing cost share in the total consumer expenditure for the 20% richest people. Now this dashed line is a 45 degrees line. So if a point is on this line, it means that regardless of your income, you spend exactly the same share of your money on the housing. Well, as you can see here, it's not in most cases it's not the case. Actually, most of the points are located below this line, meaning that low-income households tend to spend more than high-income households in percentage of their income. Maybe they spend less in absolute terms, but they spend more in relative terms. And in some cases, it can be the difference. This gap can be very big. So, like twice, for instance, high-income households spend 10%, while low-income households can spend 20-30% of their income. Another thing is what happened with this gap over time. So here, what I show is the ratio between the housing cost of the poorest people to the housing cost of the richest people. And the data aggregated, so here we have box plots that show the distribution of this ratio for decades, because we don't have so many data points. Typically, these surveys and censuses, they conducted with a very low frequency. So once in 5 years, once in 10 years. So we have to, and then they are always not always published. So we have to aggregate these things. So what we see here is that from 1980s to 1990s, there was an increase in this gap. So the difference between, in terms of housing cost share, between poor people and rich people increased. Then it stabilized for 3 decades, and then in this current decade, we see a decline. So the difference between high income and low income people in terms of housing expenditure actually decreased. Well, we have here less data, but I try to keep the list of countries more or less homogeneous. So it shouldn't be a composition effect. So that, for example, here we have data on more countries with less difference, and therefore this drives the whole distribution down. So that's not the case. Now, my idea is to try to explain this difference. Well, to try to explain the housing cost shares in the first place, and then the second place, what are the factors that are behind this housing affordability gap, as I call it. Okay, and One thing that I'm using as an explanation is the possible effect of the governmental policy. So because we know that many of housing policies are trying to fill the gap between in terms of housing between different income groups. So in order to do this, I'm using a simple panel data model with fixed effects. So this means that here we have some dependent variables, some measure of housing cost, for example, average housing cost share, or a ratio of housing cost shares for poor and rich people. And here we have a number of explanatory variables, including some standard control variables and a couple of regulation indices. And we have some country effects, country fixes. So what are the housing policies that I'm using in this analysis? Well, is it visible? Okay. So here I'm using 3 different policies: rent control, social housing as percentage of housing stock, and housing allowances as percentage of GDP. Okay, so this, as we can see here, this is the measure of availability of data. So these are the years, and these are the number of countries. For example, for rent control, we have data covering more than 125 years for almost 130 countries. For social housing, we have more or less the same data period, but just 42 countries. And you can see that the data set is not balanced. So for some countries, we don't have very actual data. And finally, for housing allowances, we have the shortest period of time. So the last 45 years, starting from 1980. And we have just 38 countries. So if we merge all the data, including control variables, with these regulation indices and the dependent variables, then we get an effective data sample size of 28 countries. So most of them in Europe, but also some in Asia, 2 countries in North America, and Australia. And the data set covers the period from 1981 to 2023, so the last 43 years. So let's just look at the dynamics of the regulation. So is it visible or not so much? Okay, fine. So here we have rent control, housing allowances, and social housing. So rent control is the index that measures the intensity of regulations. If it's equal to 0, there's no rent control at all. If it's equal to 1, that's the situation that some of us would like to have all over the world. So, and you can see that over the time, there's a decline in the intensity of rent control. So the gray lines correspond, gray lines correspond to individual countries. The black line is the median, and it's computed only for the years, or it exists only for the years when, for all countries, we have observations for all countries. So if it's not shown, then it means that for a certain year we don't have observations for all 28 countries. Okay, so we can see it here that rent control, intensity of rent control has been declining over the last 43 years. Same thing for social housing. So its proportion in the total housing stock has been declining. And in particular in 2 former socialist countries, Estonia and I think Latvia, that are included in the data set. So here the decline was very dramatic. But even without these countries, we see that there was a retrenchment in terms of social policy. By contrast, housing allowances, you cannot really see it, but just believe me that the proportion of housing allowances with respect to GDP has been increasing over time, which fits well in this narrative about retrenchment of government from social policy and replacement of such policies as rent control and social housing by subsidies like housing allowances, housing benefits. And now we are coming to the final slide with the results. So here I have 4 different models. The first model is, or the first dependent variable is the average housing cost share. Then we have housing cost shares for the first quintile, for the fifth quintile, so quintile in terms of income. So first quintile are the 20% of the poorest people. Fifth quintile is 20% of the richest people. I also have data for the second, third, and fourth quintiles, but I don't show the results here to save space. And finally, here we have housing share quintile ratio, so our measure of housing affordability gap. We have 5 different control variables, including real GDP per capita growth. And we see that it has overall negative sign, meaning that if the economy is growing faster, then the problems with the affordability of housing actually are retreating to backwards. So they are disappearing. Although this appears to not have any effect on the affordability gap. And Gini disposable income, it's a measure of income inequality. And we know that income inequality typically is correlated with housing inequality. And that's true here. I mean, we can see that the overall affordability declines when the income inequality increases. And we see also here that it happens because lower income households, the housing cost share of the lower income households go up, while that of the high income households goes down. And that leads to an increase in the housing affordability gap. We also have home ownership rate, and we know from other studies that homeowners tend to spend less money on housing than, relatively less money on housing than their counterpart tenant households. And that's actually seen here. So we see that the housing cost share is lower both for poor and rich people. And interestingly, the effect has comparable size, so that in the end of the day, we don't have any impact on the affordability gap. So this effect is more or less uniform. We also have trade openness that is used in some studies on inequality, and it can be thought as a measure of globalization. We see that it also leads actually to the increase in the affordability gap, because the low-income households suffer the most on this trade openness. I didn't find yet the nice explanation for this. So one speculation can be the thing that we talked about when talking about the short-term housing, rental housing, like if you have trade openness, you also have overall openness, and this means that more people are coming to your country and are displacing, in a certain sense, the low-income house. But I don't want to speculate more on this. And finally, talking about the control variables, we have floor area per person, which is a kind of proxy for housing quality. So we could have used, for example, the proportion of households using electricity or toilets inside the house, or hot water. But for the moment, I have data on the floor area only. And we see that it leads to the increase in the housing cost shares all over the income quintiles, which is natural, because if you have a nice, bigger and better equipped dwelling, then you tend to spend more on this. And we see that, so it's not bad thing, it's just a reflection of the fact that we pay for the quality. And we see that it leads to a reduction in the affordability gap, but this doesn't mean that the situation of the low-income households improves. It means mainly that the housing quality of high-income households improves faster than that of the low-income households. And finally, we have three policy measures. So we have rent control, social housing, and housing allowances. Rent control and social housing appear to have similar impact. So they tend to reduce the housing cost, and that's the actual answer to Felicitas, who is saying that rent control is not effective. In fact, there are hundreds of studies that show that rent control is effective, and it cannot happen if the landlords simply don't obey the law, because it leads to lower rents and therefore also to lower housing costs. Same thing for the social housing share. Interestingly, we have this impact both for poor and rich people. Well, with rent control, the thing is that rent control is applied not to people, not to households, but to dwellings. So actually, from the point of view of from the point, but I take my privilege. I'm sorry. I said to you in the very beginning we're not equal, so we're different. Inequality. I'm talking about inequality, so I have to prove it. So the rent control is applied to dwellings, so it's regardless of who lives there, poor people, rich people. I think Herman told yesterday us about the prime minister, former prime minister living in rent control dwelling.
Both of them.
Both of them. Okay, so that's one nice illustration of this. Same thing with social housing. It means tested in the beginning, but then if you are a poor student when you enter it, but then you became a rich professor, then nobody cares. So and indeed there are anecdotal evidence. There is anecdotal evidence of this rich professors living in the middle of Amsterdam, or yeah. In Germany, there are some studies that show that like 15 to 20% of people live in social housing, although they are not eligible to this. And finally, we have housing allowances, which in this case has a positive impact, meaning that, well, it's a subsidy. It's subsidy that is paid to you by the government so that you can spend more on housing and improve your housing conditions. Therefore, it's natural that the sign is positive. But one thing which kind of not easily to explain to me is that we have also positive effect for the high income households, which is a bit strange because there's a means testing every year conducted for the people receiving this type of help.
Could it be that systems like in some countries everyone gets housing subsidy, which kind of defeats the purpose because then it just drives up costs. Like everyone gets it. Just too many people get it.
Maybe.
Yeah, then it doesn't really work.
Maybe because also the results are, the measures are very aggregated. So I don't look at separate income levels in terms of for example, this housing allowances measure, and this leads to this effect. Well, that's basically all I wanted to tell you. So I didn't misuse too much my prerogative. Just wanted to say that I was supported by this Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program when doing this research. Thank you very much. And if you still have some questions to answer, to ask, I would like to answer that. Yeah.